Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at the grammar of chapter 34 from the Ecce Romani textbook. So in this video we're going to do a couple things like we normally do. We're going to look at some derivatives, right? Some English words that come from this Latin vocab in this chapter. And then we're going to dive into the chapter 34 grammar, which is on something called degrees of adjectives. So we're going to come back to adjectives and try to figure out how we say things like good, better, best, or fast, faster, fastest, right? And just make sure that we have that under control so we can start saying some more interesting things as we go through. So like I said, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to dive in with some derivatives, right? So the first one we want to look at is plus vini. Now, this means more wine in Latin, literally like more of wine. You have a genitive there. But from the word wine, right, vinum, we get a bunch of words in English. So we get words like vinegar, wine, vine, vintage. They're all coming from the Latin word for wine. And remember, part of what's happening here is the V making a W sound, which is why you have wine and vine in English. They're basically the same thing in Latin, but they're related to each other, right? The vine is where you get grapes and where you make wine. That's kind of the idea. And vinegar is, spoiled wine, basically. So there's a lot of different English words that come from this one Latin root. So it's worth thinking about. Another word we have here, a verb, is creare, which means to create or appoint, right? And this is where we actually get the word create from in English. We also get procreate, creature, recreation. They're all coming from this same root of creating, or in this context, we say appointing something. But really that idea of creating something is where we get these English words from. Next, we have prudentior, right? So this word, meaning wiser, is where we get the word prudent in English, which means something's wise, right? If you're making a wise decision, you could say, oh, that was a prudent decision. It's coming from this same root. Next, we have cura, which means a care, right? And this is where you get words like secure. So secure is actually a shortened form of sine cura, right? Without a care. So if you're secure, it means you're not worried about anything. Literally, you have no worries, you have no cares. But it's also where you get words like manicure and pedicure, right? These are talking about, getting your feet or your hands kind of taken care of or cleaned up. Literally, you're taking care of your feet or hands, is what a manicure and a pedicure is. But also words like cure and curate, right? A curator in a museum is someone who kind of takes care of the exhibit and organizes it. And, their name really means the person taking care of it. It comes from this stem of cura. So a lot of good English words coming from this Latin root. Next, we have the verb invocare, to invoke, right? And it's actually where we get the word invoke in English. Also, invocation. They're coming from the same idea of invoking something. Next, we have pessimus, right, which means worse or bad, kind of is the idea. And it's where you get pessimism and pessimist from in English. So if you call someone a pessimist, it means they're always seeing the worst in things. This is the stem of it and how it's related to that word, right? And this is where we get it in English. So when someone always seeing is always seeing the worst or the bad things, that's why we say they have pessimism, or we say that they're a pessimist. Same idea. Next, we have the verb miscere, which means to mix, right? And it's actually where you get the word mix. You can see it in that fourth principal part. And remember, a lot of the English words we have come from the fourth principal part of verbs. That's where you get mix. It's also where you get miscellaneous, right? Which is something you might not have known, but it's a word that I really enjoy teaching my students, because miscellaneous stuff or things are things that are all kind of jumbled or mixed together, right? That's the idea of it. So it's a really interesting English word that comes from this Latin root. And last, we have the verb haurire, which means to drain. So the derivative I like to teach my students is the word exhaust, right? Exhaust is sort of the stuff that drains out of something, if you want to think of it that way. So if you're thinking of your car, the exhaust is the stuff that comes out of the car, comes out of the engine. If you say you're exhausted, it literally means you're drained, right? Is kind of the idea. So it's just a cool word that comes from this, and you might not have made that connection, but it is related to this Latin verb that means to drain. In the context of our story, it's more talking about drinking, Uncle Titus draining the cup, but still, it's a good root to know. So now we want to transition into the grammar. So like I told you at the beginning of the video, we're going to look at degrees of adjectives. So it's not a particularly complicated idea, understanding in English, but there are some tricks in the Latin that we just want to unpack so that we make sure that we're feeling comfortable with this before we move out of chapter 34. So the first thing we want to ask is, what is a degree of an adjective, right? When we say that, what do we mean? What does degree mean? So an example is this. You could say, I'm happy, you are happier, she is happiest, right? Happy, happier, and happiest all come from the same root. They all come from the adjective happy, right? So what's happening here? Well, when we say degree, you're talking about sort of the level of the adjective. So if you say someone is happy, that's like the most basic form. If they're happier, it means they're a little more happy than someone else. And if you're saying, oh, she's the happiest, it means this is the most the highest possible level of happiness is kind of one way of thinking about it. So this is what we mean by degrees of an adjective. So far in the Ecce textbook, you've learned just the basic form of adjectives, really, words like happy, fast, sad, annoying, all these different adjectives. Now we're going to be able to say things like faster, stronger, fastest, right? So it's kind of opening up a new level of possibility with how you can describe things in Latin. So now that we kind of have the general idea, you want to notice here that, again, it's the degree. It's in comparison to other people, right? That's really what's happening. Or another way of what I was just explaining to you. When you say happier and happiest, you have to be making a comparison, right? You can't say, oh, I'm the happiest person when there's only one of you, right? It doesn't really make sense. And you can't say, oh, I'm happier than myself, right? That really doesn't make sense. You have to be happier than someone else. So there's a comparison happening here, which is an important idea because it's something we're going to be talking about in the next few chapters. So there's 3 degrees of adjectives. When we talk about degrees, there's 3 kind of grammar terms for them. And again, these are things that you want to kind of keep track of. You'd be able to figure it out without using these terms, again, if you don't want to get too far into the weeds of grammar. But there are specific terms for the degrees. There's the positive, the comparative, and the superlative, right? So we'll unpack all of these as we go. The positive degree. Right, the first one. This is the most basic form of an adjective, right? There's no comparison. It's just referring to the quality of one person. So this is the one you've seen so far in Ecce Romani and through your time in Latin. This is the most basic adjective form you can use. So for instance, you could use, say, the dog is happy, and that dog does look very happy, right? I'm not making a comparison. I'm not saying this is the most happy dog of all time. I'm just saying in general, the dog is happy. This is what we call the positive degree of an adjective. Now, if we wanted to change it, right, and use the comparative degree of an adjective, this is something different. This is where you actually are making a comparison between the quality of one noun with another one, right? So you're comparing 2 different things. In English, we most often use ER, right, happier, bigger, things like that. But you can also use more, right? You could say, I am more happy than you. But in general, if I was looking at this picture of the 2 dogs, I could say, oh, the dog on the right is the bigger dog. When you say bigger, I'm not just saying the dog is big, right? I could say that and say, oh, look, the dog is big. No, I'm making a comparison and saying it's bigger than the other dog. So when you make that comparison, this is why we call it the comparative degree of an adjective. I have to be comparing the bigness, if that makes sense, of the 2 dogs. And I do that by saying one is bigger than the other, right? That's what we call the comparative degree. The last degree you can use is something called the superlative degree, right? So this is emphasizing the highest degree of quality, right? Super is in there, right? So it's the highest possible form of an adjective is kind of one way to think about it. So in English, we more often than not use EST, right? Happiest, biggest. In this case, I have cutest dog, right? You could also say most or very, though. There's a couple different ways to translate it. But if I were looking at that dog on the left, I would say that's the cutest dog I've ever seen, right? I'm saying of all the dogs I've seen, this one is the absolute cutest. It's at the top, right? So I'm not really comparing 2 different things. If I had 2 dogs, I'd say, oh, that dog is cuter than the other. No, now I'm comparing all dogs and saying the highest degree of cuteness is kind of what I'm getting at. So of all the dogs I've ever seen, this one is the cutest. That's what we call the superlative degree. But how do we do this in Latin, right? So hopefully now you get a general sense of what it is in English. But how do we deal with it in Latin? Well, you've actually seen the positive degree your entire Latin career. Ever since you started Ecce Romani and they described Cornelia as laeta, happy, right? You've been seeing the positive degree. So this is the most basic form of an adjective. These are the 2 declensions we have. There's 2 groups of positive adjectives. There's first and second declension, right? A word like laetosaum, happy, right? The osaum ending. And the third declension ones, the is-a. Adjectives like brevis, right? Brief. So that's the positive degree. You've already seen these, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it because these are things that you know how to do. The new one we're looking at, the new degrees, are comparative and superlative. So again, the comparative form is when you're making that comparison bigger, stronger, faster, whatever. To use the comparative form in Latin, you take the adjective and you take its positive form, the most basic form. So for example, either laetus aum or brevis is a, right? Take the positive form and drop the ending to get the base. So for laetus, I would drop the us or the a or the um, whatever it is. My base would be light. Right? For brevis, I'm dropping the is a. My base is going to be breath, right? When you get the base, you have to add endings to it. So what endings do we add? Well, they look like third declension noun endings, so they're going to look really familiar to you. The one difference is that in the nominative singular for masculine and feminine, the ending is going to be IOR. So in other words, litior, I'll show you in a second, or brevior, right? When it's a neuter adjective, it's going to be IUS. So if I'm saying the happy building, I don't know why I'd ever say that, it would be litius, not litior. So there is a slight difference here. They look like third declension noun endings, except in that nominative singular. Then it's going to look it's going to look a little different rather, because it's going to have either an IOR or an IUS. So what do I mean? Well, this chart kind of gets at what I'm getting at here. So if you look here, these are the different adjective endings rather for comparative degree. So you take your base. In this case, I was using the adjective lightus. So I have LAET, light, right? For the nominative singular, it's litior for the masculine and feminine, like we just said, and litius for the neuter. There's the IUS. For everything else, I'm taking litior, right, my nominative ending there, and I'm adding on the endings is, ema. They're third declension noun endings, right? Then you have ace, ibus, ace, ibus. In the neuter column, the one thing you want to notice, and again, with nominative, with neuter adjectives, neuter nouns and adjectives, the nominative and accusative are always the same thing, which is why we have litius repeating. It's nominative singular neuter and it's accusative singular neuter, right? Otherwise, it looks the same. When you get to the plural neuters, this is where you see a. Remember, a is the nominative and accusative plural noun ending and adjective ending when you're dealing with neuter, right? But otherwise, this is the idea. You just take your adjective, you get its base, you add IOR, and then you add on your endings, right? That's really all you're doing to make a comparative degree of an adjective, okay? The next degree we want to talk about, the last one, is superlative. Now, this does something different. You still start in the same place. You take your adjective, you drop the ending, and you get your base, right? Same process. But now we need to do something different. Now to that base, we add on isimus right? It's using first and second declension adjective endings. So comparative is using third declension noun endings. Superlative is using first and second declension adjective endings. So it's a different idea here, right? So you would take, for instance, lightus, drop the US, and you have light, and you add on isimus That's why I have down below litissimus. And on the other side, we have brevissimus, right? That's the superlative degree. For adjectives that end in ER, instead of using isimus, you use rimus, so RIMUS, right? And I'll show you some examples. So there is a slight difference. If the positive form of my adjective ends in an ER, I do something slightly different. But otherwise, this is a pretty basic formula to get the superlative, okay? And I'll show you in a little bit some examples. But one thing you do want to know is that most adjectives that end in LIS follow our normal pattern for superlative, right? Meaning they're going to add on isimus to the stem. But there's 6 exceptions, okay? And I'll give you an example here. These 6, when they end in LIS, in the positive, they use limus, LIMUS, in the superlative, right? So one example is facilis, which means easy. So I don't say facilissimus, I say facilimus, right? I'm adding an limus to it. There's 5 others that do this. You might as well memorize them, right? Or just point them out as you see them through the Ecce story. But you have difficilus, which means difficult, similus, similar, dissimilus, meaning dissimilar, then gracilis, which means slender, and humilis, which means humble. These 6 adjectives all end in lis in their positive form, right? And so instead of using the isimus ending for the superlative, they're using limus. It's just something you want to take note of so that you don't get confused when you're working through this. So this is kind of a quick recap if you're thinking comparative and superlative and how to use it. Remember, comparative, it's comparing the quality of one noun to another. And we more often than not use ER in English, right? Better, stronger, faster. But you can also use more. You could say more fast instead of faster. It would mean the same thing. The superlative is when you're emphasizing the highest degree of that quality, right? And we use EST. You actually just heard me say it. Highest is a superlative, right? The EST is really what we use in English. So fastest, highest. But you could also say most or very. So you can say, oh, that's very fast. That's the same idea as fastest, right? I'm saying it's the most. So there's a couple different ways to do it. And this is a recap of what they look like. These 2 charts are showing you the positive, comparative, and superlative degrees for adjectives, okay? So the basic form again, for most first and second and third declension adjectives is the comparative is just the base with IOR added to it and IUS for the neuter. The superlative is the base plus isimus That's what you're seeing in the top one. Down below, I'm showing you a couple exceptions. The first thing you have for an exception is the ER words like miser and pulcher, right? Remember, when your word ends in ER, the comparative doesn't change. You're still doing the same thing. The superlative, though, instead of using issimos, you're using rimus. So you wouldn't say miserissimus, right? You're saying miserimus or pulcherimus, right? You're kind of doubling up on that R sound. Okay. And then we have down below, you have a couple other examples of third declension adjectives doing the same thing, right? Celerimus, acerimus. And you want to remember, too, those 6 special adjectives that end in lis in the positive, they're going to use limus in the superlative. Okay. So there is sort of a basic formula here with a couple of tweaks as you go. So what about translating these, right? So why do you keep seeing different translations in your textbook? Well, it's exactly what I just told you, right? There's several ways to translate the comparative and superlative, okay? The comparative is usually happier, superlative, happiest. But for the comparative, you could also say more happy or rather happy. And the superlative, you can do very happy and most happy. There's a couple different ways to do it. Go with whatever works best for you in the context of the sentence and what you feel comfortable with, right? You'll be fine. Here's some examples, okay? So if I'm describing this dog, again, positive, I could say canis lightus, the happy dog, canis lightior, the happier dog, and canis lightissimus, the happiest dog. This is just a normal first and second declension adjective, right? Happy, lightus. If I use a third declension adjective, no big deal, right? You could say canis fortis, the strong dog, canis fortior, the stronger dog, and the canis fortissimus, right? There's a superlative, the strongest or bravest dog, however you want to say it. Now, here's an example where we're using one of those ER adjectives, right? Keller, fast. So canis keller, the fast dog, kellerior, the faster dog, and look at the superlative. It's kellerimus, right? There's our R-I-M-U-S ending, the fastest dog. Again, the superlative is really the big thing to look for when you have the ER adjectives. Here, we have one of those special LIS adjectives, graculus, the slender dog, right? In the comparative, gracilior, no big deal there. But look at the superlative, canis gracilimus, the most slender dog, the slenderest, you could say, dog. It's the limus in the superlative. That's the change you're seeing. So these are just a couple examples to help you see these in action and understand kind of how the comparative and superlative work. Now we're going to look at some examples from the Ecce textbook, right? Actual Latin examples. So here we have pueri a Cornelio, visi ad cubiculum parum redierunt. So the boys, having been seen by Cornelius, right? So we have our perfect passive participle there, visi a Cornelio, right? They returned to the small bedroom, cubiculum parvum. Parvum is a positive adjective. It's just the small bedroom, right? They went back to it. Parvum is matching cubiculum in case number gender, right? Here, we have something similar, but now we're talking about the dinner guests, right? The convivi. Induerunt, they put on coronas rosarum pulchriorum, crowns of beautifuler, you might say, or more beautiful, you might say, rather beautiful, roses, right? So I'm describing the roses with a comparative. It's pulchriorum, right? Notice how I have pulchrior, right? The IOR plus the genitive plural ending, the UM, because rosarum is genitive plural. So I'm saying they're not just roses, they're beautifuler, right? Roses that are more beautiful than others, you might say. So that's the comparative in action. And lastly, we have a superlative, right? You could say plaustrum novissimum, right? The newest wagon was sent to the country house. Novissimum is the adjective novosaum, right, new, and it's describing the wagon. So I have the superlative on it, issimum, and it's neuter singular because I'm describing a plaustrum, right, the neuter singular case number gender, right? So this is how they work in action. There's nothing too crazy here. We're still matching case number gender. You're just changing the spelling, basically, whether it's comparative or superlative, because you've been using positive this whole time. We're just getting a different way to use adjectives. So don't freak out. You'll be fine. It's just a different way of doing it. Now, one thing you do want to keep track of, there are irregular adjectives, of course, right? It's Latin. There's always got to be an exception. So there are some irregular adjectives you need to pay attention to. These are them. I would say just memorize them. The reason they're irregular is because the positive, comparative, and superlatives are not spelled the same way. But this actually happens in English. Look at my English translation. You'll see that we do this too. We don't say good, good, or goodest. We say good, better, best. And we don't say bad, bad, or baddest, right? You could, but you also say bad, worse, and worst. Right? So there's a typo there, it should be worse. So these are just irregular. A lot of times they're regular in English, but in Latin, they definitely are irregular. So look at the spelling. They're spelled differently, which makes them irregular. These you just want to memorize and make sure you got kind of a good understanding of so that you're not getting too freaked out by it. So let's just do a quick recap. This is the recap. Adjectives have degrees, right? Positive, comparative, and superlative. You've seen positive before. Now we're adding two more. Comparative, you're comparing the quality of one noun to another one. Superlative, you're emphasizing the highest degree of that quality, right? The best, the highest, the fastest, whatever it is. In Latin, the positive is just a first and second declension adjective, osa or third, is a. You've seen these before. The comparative is eor, that eor ending, plus third declension noun endings. The superlative is the base plus isimosa or rimosa or limosa depending on how our positive adjective is spelled. And remember, there are some irregular adjectives too. You just need to memorize them because they have irregular forms. But hopefully this helps you understand it. Feel free to go back, look through the notes, pause the video. But again, these are things you can figure out. Just put a little practice into it and you'll be fine. Okay, so the more you practice, the more you work on these, the better off you're going to be. Good luck.